lit.
Uhuru, comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Make sure to hit that like button and share the video on the platform that you're viewing from. This week, Chairman Omali Yeshitela continues a study on dialectical materialism. He will read from Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth, starting on page 68 with the subhead, Consider Things in Their Interconnection and Circumstances. The study materials have been linked in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions for your benefit. For the first hour, the chairman will review the study materials, and in the second, we will open it up to you, our live viewers, to ask your questions. It's my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Comrade Director Akile. I just want to appreciate everybody coming on today, and you, Comrade Director, for what it is that you bring to every one of these sessions. And I also just want to remind people again that we are reading from this book by Maurice Cornforth, Materialism and the Dialectical Method. It is something that we've used essentially because we really appreciate the fact that Cornforth gives us an opportunity to speak to the issue of philosophy, despite the fact that we disagree with what he has even considered philosophy, specifically as it relates to dialectical and historical materialism, or dialectical materialism in this case, or materialism in the dialectical method. Here, he has described the method, that is to say, the method of investigation and analysis that we call dialectical materialism as the actual philosophy. We disagree with that. We think that sound and scientific philosophy comes about as a consequence of successful and correctly employing dialectical and historical materialist methods of investigating and analysis. And we think that's the method and not the philosophy itself. So we also recognize that Cornforth was attached to for a very long time. And when he wrote the materials that we're working from, the Communist Party of England, and he was obviously an active member of the Communist Party there. And we've always had very serious political problems with the British or English or the British Communist Party, and most of the communist parties for that matter, that have existed throughout Europe and the United States. And this is partially because they've been able to get away with characterizing themselves or their view as Marxism, their view as a philosophy. They've been able to obscure the fact that they have taken the method of investigation and analysis and used it to ends that don't necessarily speak to most people around the world. So, and that's certainly been true when it's come to African people and how they've intervened in our lives and how they've used the concepts that we will have been discussing as a means of being able to justify colonial policy that's existed throughout the world, including the United States and Europe and in Africa. Nevertheless, I want to go ahead and begin reading from Cornforth's work. And we are on page 68, as it has been mentioned. And sometimes we use Cornforth as a foil. It gives us an opportunity to deepen the question and to explore differences that we have with the outlook of Cornforth and Marx in some instances. But we think it's a good sort of structure and that we can use to advance this discussion. And we think, and so saying that we disagree with so much of what Cornforth has presented and much of what Marx has presented is not to discard the whole process of, or the method of investigation and analysis that we characterize as dialectical materialism, nor to discard everything that Marx said. There are some things that we think is very sound here that we use, and we want you to have access to. The other thing that we said, however, is that it's really important for you to take the works of African internationalism, the things that I've written, particularly in various political reports to our congresses and plenary, and to study them, especially members of the African People's Socialist Party and our movement. Because here you will have an application, you will see an application of dialectical historical materialism and applied to the real world that we live in. And we think that that will help anybody to understand what it is that Cornforth is trying to do, or what Cornforth is saying, and our differences, and that's important as well. Also, in the short term, we'll be we'll be releasing the political report to the plenary, the third plenary of our 7th Congress within the next week or two. And there, I think we'll be introducing some really important conclusions that we have come to utilizing dialectical historical materialist method that are real departures from much of what it is that Cornforth says here. And I think that you will find them extremely important. Certainly we in the African People's Socialist Party and our movement, we will find extremely important in terms of charting the path that we have to go and the basis for going in the direction we'll be moving forthcoming. So I want to also acknowledge the fact that some people have less appreciation for theory, for philosophy, and really chomping at the bits, saying, well, now that's good, but let's go to work, let's do stuff. And I agree that practice is primary, but the fact is that we cannot liquidate or ignore the issue of theory. Theory is just such a critical thing, and it's one of the things that help us to understand, one of the things that the presence of which is absolutely necessary if we are going to have a successful revolution. So we think it's important that people should pay attention to that and not be intimidated by it either, because this issue of theory has for the longest time been the purview of the learned a minority in our communities who really, generally speaking, are not from us, but they descend into our communities with all the brilliance and what have you, most often separate from from our reality, and most often not applicable. In fact, I think that you'll find it to be true that many people who call themselves Marxists and communism have succeeded more than anybody else in turning Africans off from Marxism and communism, just because what they have brought to us is just a gusset up version of colonialism by another name. But anyway, let's begin. We're on page 68, and there is a sort of head that where we begin considering things in their interconnections and circumstances, considering things in their interconnection and circumstances. The dialectical method demands first that we should consider things not each by itself, but always in their interconnection with other things. This sounds obvious. Nevertheless, it is an obvious principle, which is very often ignored and extremely important to remember. We have already considered it and some examples of its application in discussing metaphysics, since the very essence of metaphysics is to think of things in an abstract way, isolated from their relations with each other and from the concrete circumstances in which they exist. The principle of considering things in relationship to actual conditions and circumstances, and not apart from these actual conditions and circumstances, is always of fundamental importance for the working class movement in deciding the most elementary questions of policy. For example, there was a time when the British workers were fighting for a 10-hour day. They were right at that time not to make their immediate demand an 8-hour day, since this was not yet a realizable demand. They were equally right when they got a 10-hour day not to be satisfied with it. There's a lot to be talked about here, but I'm hoping that part of what we've talked about up to now and things that we'll speak moving forward will help to clarify real contradictions that we might have with that statement about the British workers fighting for a 10-hour day, and then they were right, not to make their immediate demand an 8-hour day, since this was not yet realized demand. But the obvious thing that's here that's obvious to African internationalists in terms of how we understand the world in a way that distinguishes us from people who characterize themselves as Marxists. And we have come to these conclusions using the scientific investigation provided to us by Dialectical Materialism, is that even the 8-hour day, the 10-hour day that the British workers were fighting for was something that that was made feasible, even to conceive. Even the righteous 10-hour day compared to the conditions of existence of the Africans throughout Africa and India and the various other places where England, the British, were sucking life and blood and resources from people there. The fact is that Karl Marx was absolutely correct when he made the statement some time ago. That's forgotten by most Marxists and most or ignored or not completely comprehended by those who consider themselves Marxists and communists, etc. Is that the statement that was so profoundly significant is that the so-called wage slave in England, who we are talking about now, using Cornforth's words here, fighting for a 10-hour day, the wage slaves in England or in Europe required for a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. So the British workers, who are characterized as wage slaves, and the reason they are characterized as wage slaves, the reference here about slavery is to what is happening with Africans and other people around the world who are living under European colonial domination. And so they're saying that what the Europeans, including the British, fighting for the 10-hour day as opposed to the 8-hour day, the thing that distinguishes them from making a reasonable or unreasonable demands of things that helps to us to understand whether or not they were applying a dialectical process and what they were fighting for. The fact is that everything they got, like the bourgeoisie that they were struggling with, came as a consequence of sucking the blood, sucking the resources from the real slaves, slavery pure and simple, from the Africans, from the Indians, from the oppressed peoples around the world upon whom, and which helps us to understand that what we were looking at is a new mode of production that had come into existence that we call colonial mode of production. So that's a point that I want to make. And we'll go into this in the coming days and certainly going into our plenary forthcoming, the February of next year. There are times when it is correct for a section of workers to come out on strike, and there are times when it is not correct. Such matters have to be judged according to actual circumstances of the case. Similarly, there are times when it is correct to go on prolonging and extending a strike, and there are times when it is correct to call it off. No working class leader can be of very much value if he tries to decide questions of policy in terms of general principle alone, without taking into account the actual circumstances in relation to which policy has to be operated, without understanding that the same policy can be right in one case and wrong in another, depending on the concrete circumstances of each case. Thus, Lenin wrote, quote, "Of course, in politics, in which sometimes extremely complicated national and international relationships become between classes and parties have to be dealt with, it would be absurd to concoct a recipe or general rule that would serve in all cases. One must have the brains to analyze the situation of each separate case," unquote. This readiness on the part of Marxists to adapt policy to circumstances and to change policy with circumstances is sometimes called communist opportunism. But it is nothing of the kind, or rather it is the very opposite. It is the application and practice of the science of the strategy and tactics of working class struggle. Indeed, what is meant by opportunism in relation to working class policy? It means subordinating the long-term interests of the working class as a whole to the temporary interests of a section, sacrificing the interests of the class to defense of the temporary privileges of some particular group. Communists are guided. So this is what we talk about. I think it's important to point this out. What is opportunism? The question is raised here. They say opportunism, it means subordinating the long-term interests of the working class as a whole to the temporary interests of a section. For example, if we talk about African people and look at opportunism, the highest expression of opportunism in the African community is neocolonialism, because the neocolonialists would sacrifice the long-term interests of the whole African working class and nation for total liberation to some privilege that it can get to be the chief, to be the prime minister, or to be something in one of these neo-colonial entities that crisscrosses throughout the African world. That's the essence of opportunism. That's the struggle that we find ourselves involved in, often in the African People's Socialist Party, when we complain and criticize certain kinds of policies, a slogan like Black Lives Matter or Hands Up, Don't Shoot, and people say, well, that's really popular. That's what's happening all the time. There's a certain kind of popular philosophy. We call it pop philosophy. There's a form of opportunism here because it doesn't inform, it sacrifices, it subdues, it obscures the long-term interests of our people for total liberation, which is not to say that we can't have a struggle for total liberation that will often call for something short of that. But what we call for short of that has to be something that contributes to getting to where it is that we're trying to go. And some simple-minded thing like Black Lives Matter doesn't contribute to that at all. I mean, that's one of the reasons we have characterized it as opportunism. So anyway, we say, and this requires that in the interest of the movement as a whole, one must analyze the situation in each separate case, deciding what policy to pursue in each case in the light of the concrete circumstances. On general questions too, for example, when people are rising up, engage in sharp and serious struggle that actually has the ruling class or the social system or the colonial capitalist system on the back foot, when you can see that is happening, then to step in and then raise demands or slogans that will call for something like everybody, let's get along together. Let's recognize that our lives matter too. That is opportunism. That's a concrete situation where the masses are on the offensive and have seized the time more or less, or trying to seize the time. And then the leadership steps in and tells it not to seize the time, but to settle for just being liked by the oppressor. On general questions, too, the greatest confusion can arise from forgetting the dialectical principle that things must not be considered in isolation, but in their inseparable interconnection. For example, the British labor leaders once said, and many members of the Labor Party continue to say, that nationalization is an installment of socialism. They consider nationalization by itself, in isolation, out of connection with the state and with the social structure in relation to which nationalization measures are introduced. They overlook the fact that if the public power, the state, remains in the hands of the exploiters, and if their representatives sit on and control the boards of the nationalized industries, which continue to be run on the basis of exploiting the labor of one class for the profit of another class, then nationalization is not socialism. Socialist nationalization can come into being only when the public power, the state, is in the hands of the workers. Again, in political argument, people often appeal to a concept of fairness, which leads them to judge events without the slightest consideration of the real meaning of those events, of the circumstances in which they occur. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. That is the principle employed in such arguments. Thus, it is argued that if we defend the democratic rights of the workers in a capitalist country to agitate for the ending of capitalism and the introduction of socialism, then we cannot deny to others in a socialist country the right to agitate for the ending of socialism and the reintroduction of capitalism. Those who argue like this throw up their hands in horror when they find that counter-revolutionary groupings in the Soviet Union, who sought to restore capitalism in that country, were deprived of the possibility of carrying out their aims. And this is what we see happening like in China, and like in Cuba. We hear people and the bourgeoisie talking about this all the time. Look at the Cubans, they don't give freedom of press to these thugs who want to bring capitalism back into Cuba. Venezuela, look at what Venezuela, the Venezuelans don't allow these thugs who want to reintroduce the domination of the Venezuela by the bourgeoisie, the international bourgeoisie, the colonial capitalist ruling class of the world. And see, since they don't do that, they are undemocratic. And many people who don't have a good grip on this question, who take an approach to it that's not dialectical, they will not be able to understand this and come to the best kinds of conclusion. That's why it's important for us to have this discussion right now among people who have assumed the responsibility to lead our people and lead the world, if you will, to socialist or communist conclusions, to overturn a social system that's based on exploitation and stealing the resources of the working and oppressed peoples, et cetera. So from their perspective, they would say that the Cubans are wrong because they won't allow the restoration of capitalism. The Venezuelans are wrong because they won't allow the restoration of unbridled capitalist exploitation of the country. That they won't allow the neo-colonialists representing U.S. and other imperial forces to come in and steal everything at the expense of the people of Venezuela. So they say that the Venezuelans are not fair, it's not democratic, and therefore there's something illegitimate about Venezuela and or Cuba and other countries which have had the audacity to take the power away from the colonizer or from the oppressor. And even if you look at non-communist or non-socialist movements, such as what we've seen happen in Afghanistan, the US government and imperialist powers have sucked the blood, resources, the life, the education, the healthcare system, the infrastructure development, potential, all those things out of Afghanistan now for hundreds or more years. And now when the Afghans themselves overthrow US and kick them out of the country, then the US decides that, and along with all these white power, all these these filthy imperialist, capitalist white countries, that something is wrong with the Afghan under the leadership of the Taliban, because the Taliban is a religious extremist or organization, and they don't allow women to have certain kinds of rights. When the U.S. and the other imperial powers have determined that the Afghans shouldn't have any rights at all, and that they press the people down and crush them. And so they use this kind of argument, the US and the imperialist powers, white power, British, that Cornforth is talking about now. They use these arguments as a basis for being able to steal and loot Afghanistan even more. They won't even turn back over to the Afghan people their own money that have been locked up in these financial institutions, economic institutions controlled by the imperialists, in particular by the United States. And they engage in all kinds of wars against the Afghan people, trying to maintain confusion so that the Taliban would not be able to govern. And they use these arguments that the Taliban is undemocratic. Here, colonialism, they would declare, is democratic. Colonialism that will allow, in theory, women to be able to get an education and run for office in a colonial arrangement that's established for the purpose of sucking resources out of Afghanistan, that would be representing the Europeans. We represent the US as opposed to people in Afghanistan. So they say, we prefer this kind of democratic arrangement where this is democratic, what the Taliban doing, that kicks us out, that kicks the foreigners out, that kicks the aliens who are exploiting the whole country and the whole people out. That is undemocratic. Why? They exclaim, this is undemocratic, this is tyranny. Such an argument, I'm with Cornforth now. Such an argument overlooks the difference between fighting in the interest of the vast majority of the people to end exploitation and fighting in the interest of a small section to preserve or reintroduce exploitation. It overlooks the difference between defending the right of the vast majority to run their affairs in their own interest and defending the right of a small minority to keep the majority in bondage. In other words, it overlooks the difference between moving forward and backwards, between putting the clock ahead and putting it back, between revolution and counter-revolution. Of course, if we fight to achieve socialism, and if we achieve it, then we shall defend what we have achieved and shall not allow the slightest possibility of any group destroying that achievement. Let the capitalists and their hangers-on shout about democracy in general. If, as Lenin said, we have the brains to analyze the situation, we shall not be deceived by them. And by the way, when we talk about something like socialism, we are talking about this interim between what has been characterized as capitalism, or what we characterize as the colonial capitalist mode of production. We are talking about this interim. Socialism is this interim between the defeat of colonial capitalism and the acquisition of communism, which is a classless society. And socialism itself is what is characterized as the dictatorship of the working class. When the working class, and there is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, as quiet as it's kept. Even the United States and its mediums that are screaming about the lack of democracy in Afghanistan once the US and all of these thugs are kicked out. The fact is that they have a hidden dictatorship. The dictatorship is real, except it's not that hidden when you got to use bombs and murder and various kinds of imperialist forms of thuggery to maintain it. It's not that hidden. This is real open kind of war that's been made in public sight. But the fact is that even that in public sight can be dismissed and obscured depending on how people view it. And how people view it is depending on what capacity they have in terms of investigating and analyzing this reality, whether they have the ability to utilize a dialectical materialist method of seeing the world, or whether they would like the idea of what the world should be really ruin their perception and block their ability to understand things as they are. So as we quote here again, if as Lenin said, we have the brains to analyze the situation, we shall not be deceived by them. We're on page 70, the last paragraph on the bottom of the page, Cornforth's book. The liberal concept of fairness has indeed become a favorable weapon of reaction lately. In 1949 and again in 1950, when the fascists decided to hold a demonstration in London on May Day, the Home Secretary promptly banned the Workers' May Day demonstration. If I ban one, I must ban the other, he blandly explained. How scrupulously fair he was. The principle of understanding things and so the example that Cornforth is giving is that the fascists were going to demonstrate on May Day. And so because the pressure was high to keep the fascists from being able to demonstrate, and this is during a time when Hitler was fashionable also, and fascists throughout Europe in some quarters had become unfashionable. A lot of quarters they weren't. That's why they were so profoundly powerful. They did an Obama, in England. So they denied the fascists who wanted to come to power the right to demonstrate and things like that. And then since they did that to the fascists, they felt like they were obligated, or they claimed an obligation to do it against the communists or the workers or the Democrats who wanted to keep the society open. This is the kind of fairness that they talk about. And sometimes even revolutionaries are duped by this kind of logic that comes from the bourgeoisie. And sometimes they say, well, we're not duped, but we go along with it because we know the workers are too stupid to understand these questions. So we sell out in their interest. Anyway, the principle of understanding things in their circumstances and interconnections is likewise a very important principle in science. Yet scientists who take things to bits and consider their various properties very often forget that things which they may consider in isolation do not exist in isolation. And this leads to serious misunderstandings. Soviet biologists, for example, guided by this first principle of dialectics, have stressed the unity of the organism and its environment. They have the unity of the organism and its environment. They have pointed out that you cannot consider the organism as having a nature of its own, isolated from its environment. That is metaphysics. Thus, there is no such thing as a plant, for instance, isolated from its environment. Such a plant is a mere museum piece, a dead plant artificially preserved. Living plants grow in a soil, in a climate, in an environment, and they grow and develop by assimilating that environment. Thus, Lysenko defined the heredity or nature of an organism as its requirement of certain conditions for its life and development, and this responding to various conditions in a certain way. This understanding of the unity of organisms and environment had important consequences, for it led to the expectation that by compelling an organism to adapt itself to and assimilate changed conditions, its nature could be changed. And this expectation has been verified in practice. So I hope that is clear. This whole notion of trying to look at a plant or anything in biology or in nature or any place as something that can be understood without looking at the conditions for its existence, without looking at its environment, you can't understand a thing like that. And if you come to some conclusion, you come to the wrong conclusion. Nevertheless, this is what happens too often when people are looking at the situation with African Africans, or when people are looking at the world through the lenses of white power, and I mean of colonialism. And colonialism there's socialists and capitalists and everything in between who exist as colonizers. Their existence is based on the colonial domination, the domination of other peoples and countries. The biologists of the Mendel-Morgan school, on the other hand, treat the organism abstractly, metaphysically, as isolated from its real conditions of life. They conceive of the so-called nature of the organism as quite independent of its conditions of life. Hence, they conclude in true metaphysical style that the heredity of an organism is what it is, and that it is no use trying to change it in the ways in which Soviet biologists have changed the heredity of organisms. Considering things in their movement, they're coming into being and going out of being. Let us now consider some examples of the second principles of dialectics, which demand that we should consider things in their movement that change. They're coming into being and going out of being. So we consider things in their relationship to everything else, the environment, et cetera. That's one example, that's one principle. And now we're talking about that even this, when you look at this, it's not enough, that we have to also consider things in their movement, their change. They're coming into being and going out of being. And we've said that motion is a condition for matter, that things, motion is absolutely necessary, and that's true in society too. Things are constantly coming into existence, going out of existence. The old dies out as a condition for the rise of the new, and vice versa. So this principle too is of great importance in science. Soviet biologists, for example, guided by this principle of dialectics, have considered the organism in its growth and development. Thus, at a certain stage of growth, the nature of the organism is still plastic. If you can modify it at that stage, you can often change its nature, give it a changed heredity. Something is newly coming into being in the organism, and that is the time to foster it and to give it a desired direction. But if that stage is past, then its nature becomes fixed and you cannot change it. You must find just the right stage of growth if you wish to modify the heredity of the organism. The biologists of the Mendel-Morgan school, on the other hand, consider the nature of the organism as given and fixed from the very start. This second principle of dialectics teaches us always to pay attention to what is new, to what is rising and growing, not just to what exists at the moment, but to what is coming into being. This principle is of paramount importance for revolutionary understanding, for revolutionary practice. And that's really important for us to understand, brothers and sisters and comrades, because at any given time, if we don't know what we are looking at, or if we just look at how the social system presents itself to the world, then it can look very strong, despite the fact that it's weak. It's extraordinarily weak. It's going through profound crisis, etc. If we don't know what we're looking at. Let's see here. Reading Cornforth again on page 72. The Russian Bolsheviks, for example, saw from the very beginning how Russian society was moving, what was new in it, what was coming into being. They looked for what was rising and growing, though it was still weak, the working class, while others discounted the importance of the working class and finished by entering into compromises with the forces of the old society. The Bolsheviks concluded that the working class was the new rising force and led it to victory. Just this same understanding of what was rising and growing and what was disintegrating and dying away was exemplified in Stalin's leadership during the war, 1941-45. When the Germans were before Moscow in November 1941, and all the Allied military strategists outside the Soviet Union considered that Russia's defeat was certain, Stalin said that while the Germans were at the peak of their military power in the Soviet Union, on the other hand, was still mobilizing and increasing. Therefore, the defeat of German fascists was certain. Quote, Germany, whose reserves of manpower are already being exhausted, has been considerably more weakened than the Soviet Union, whose reserves are only now being mobilized to the full. Can there be any doubt that we can and are bound to defeat the German invaders? The German invaders are straining their last efforts. There is no doubt that Germany cannot sustain such a strain for long, unquote. Similarly, today, when press and radio are full of the boasts and threats of the American imperialists and their henchmen, we stress that what is rising and growing all over the world, the people's camp of peace, which is bound to continue to grow and to overwhelm the imperialists in shameful disaster. Again, in the fight for unity of the working class movement in relation to the British Labour Party and the affiliated trade unions, we pay attention above all to that which is rising and growing in the movement. Therefore, we see a great deal more than the policy of the right-wing leaders and their influence. The right wing has its basis in the past, though it is still strong and dominant, but there are arising the forces in the future determined to fight against capitalism and war. And we see this also when we look at things in the US and other parts of the world, because there is reaction is deepening all over the world. The colonialists of all stripes, excuse me, comrades, the colonialists of all stripes bearing down, becoming more impressive, threatening the world, engaged in war games to try and frighten and intimidate peoples, countries, et cetera, in order to maintain the status quo. But this is a state of desperation that we're looking at. And if we understand that the whole social system itself is a colonial mode of production that came into existence, its very existence came about as a consequence of what it was able to steal from colonized people, and particularly from Africa and African people and others subsequent to that, then we see that its desperation is based on what? Its war bluster, its warmongering is based on what? It's based on the fact that they're finding it more difficult to get those resources that they've stolen from the colonized. So sometimes it's because, as in Venezuela, the people have been able to hold on and to try to chart their own independent course, as they have done in Cuba, as they are trying to do throughout South America. Sometimes it's less clear in terms of where everything is going, but what is clear is that there's a challenge to the ability of the colonizers to hold on to their resources because of disruptions, sometimes even looking like chaos that sometimes were not directly due to the what the colonizers themselves have done, like in Africa. It makes these resources more difficult for them to get. Sometimes it's because there is a growing struggle among the colonial powers themselves over who is going to get what, or powers that have emerged to challenge the traditional historical colonizer for control of access to the resources that have come from colonialism. And this is something that makes for desperate situation by the colonizers. And so they bluster and they brag about their war capacity, and they show off their war machinery. They intervene in countries in a very desperate and sometimes brazen way. But this is evidence of not of strength, but of desperation, because they are losing, and we have to be able to understand that. We have to be able to know what caused this thing to come into existence. At the moment we recognize the singular significance of colonial and the existence of a colonial mode of production, this is what has blocked the ability of so many people to see clearly What we have been characterizing as capitalism for so long is a colonial mode of production, a colonial mode of production that came into existence with the defeat or with the end. It is what helped to bring the feudal mode of production to an end. The feudal mode of production, which was essentially limited to what was happening in Europe, and which, according to Marx's assumptions, led automatically to the rise of capitalism, but it didn't. It led to the rise of another mode of production that is called colonialism. A colonial mode of production is what propelled the entire history in the direction that it has moved now and thrust Europe into a new relation, into existence, and to a new relationship with peoples around the world. And it's this feudal mode of production that is in a state of crisis right now. And that is responsible, and it has been in a state of crisis for the longest period of time. And that's what it is that we're looking at. And so to see the bluster and what have you coming from the United States and England and these other countries, and this entity called this nasty white nationalist entity called Israel. These things, this is pure desperation that we're looking at, the things that they are doing, the threats that they are making, etc., because they are dying. And these are articulations and gurgling, death gurgles, if you will, of a dying social system. And so we should not be intimidated by that. And we shouldn't see the losses and defeat of the colonizers as our loss and defeat. These represent for us as revolutionary anti-colonialists, as genuine communists, as those who recognize that Marx was right when he said that capitalism required in Europe required as a pedestal a colonialism pure and simple in the New World, us. So such examples, Cornforth again, such examples of these show that the basis of the dialectical method, its most essential principle, is to study and understand things in their concrete interconnection and movement. I'm on page 73. Against ready-made schemes, truth is always concrete. Sometimes people imagine that dialectics is a preconceived scheme into the pattern of which everything is supposed to fit. This is the very opposite of the truth about dialectics. The employment of the Marxist dialectical method does not mean that we apply a preconceived scheme and try to make everything fit into it. No, it means that we study things as they really are, and their real interconnection and movement. This is something which Lenin insisted on again and again. Indeed, he proclaimed it as the fundamental thesis of dialectics. Genuine dialectics, Lenin wrote, proceeds by means of a thorough, detailed analysis of a process in all its concreteness. The fundamental thesis of dialectics is there's no such thing as abstract truth. Truth is always concrete. Excuse me, comrades. What did he mean by truth is always concrete? Just that we will not get at the truth about things, about either nature or society, by thinking up some general scheme, some abstract formula, but only by trying to work out as regards each process, just what are the forces at work, how they are related, which are rising and growing, and which are decaying and dying away. And on this basis, reaching an estimate of the process as a whole. So Engels said, there could be no question of building the laws of dialectics into nature, but of discovering them in it and evolving them from it. nature is the test of dialectics. As regards the study of society and the estimates we make of real social changes on which we base our political strategy, Lenin ridiculed those who took some abstract preconceived scheme as their guide. According to some authorities, the Marxist dialectics laid it down that all development must proceed through triads: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Lenin ridiculed this. It is clear to everybody that the main burden of Engels' argument is that materialists must direct the historical process correctly and accurately, and that insistence on selection of examples which demonstrate the correctness of the triad is nothing but a relic of Hegelianism. Hegelianism is the philosophy of a man, Hegel, who was very influential for Marx and Engels in terms of and their early development, a lot of Europeans. And indeed, once it has been categorically declared that an attempt to prove everything by triads is absurd, what significance can examples of dialectical process have? Anyone who reads the definition and description of the dialectical method given by Engels will see that the Hegelian triads are not even mentioned, and that it all amounts to regarding social evolution as a natural historical process of development. What Marx and Engels call the dialectical method is nothing more nor less than the scientific method of sociology, which consists in regarding society as a living organism in a constant state of development, the study of which requires an objective analysis of the relations of production that constitute the given social formation and an investigation of its laws of functioning and development. Let us consider some examples of what the analysis of a process in its concreteness and the principle that truth is always concrete mean, in contrast to the method of trying to lay down some preconceived scheme of social development and of appealing to such a scheme as a basis for policy. In Tsarist Russia, that is Russia under the domination of the Tsar, who was a feudal leader of Russia that was overthrown during the process of the Russian Revolution. In Tsarist Russia, the Mensheviks used to say, we must have capitalism before socialism. First, capitalism must go through its full development, then socialism will follow. That was their scheme. Consequently, they supported the liberals in politics and enjoined the workers to do no more than fight for better conditions in the capitalist factories. As quiet as it's kept initially, the so-called Bolsheviks, who were under Lenin's leadership, also followed that formula. And it was Lenin who actually had to threaten at one point to resign from the party as a part of the struggle he was engaged in to force them to move beyond that. And because initially, even the Bolsheviks refused to seize power when it was possible, because they said that it didn't make sense because according to Marx, they had to first have capitalism before they could have socialism, and therefore capitalism had to develop fully in order for socialism to come into existence. Cornforth on page 75 reads, Lenin repudiated this silly scheme. He showed that the liberals, frightened by the workers, would compromise with the Tsar, but that the alliance of workers with peasants could take the lead from them, overthrow the Tsar, and then go on to overthrow the capitalists and build socialism before ever social capitalism was able to develop fully. After the proletarian revolution was successful, another scheme was propounded, this time by Trotsky. You can't build socialism in one country. Unless the revolution takes place in the advanced capitalist country, socialism cannot come to Russia. Lenin and Stalin showed the scheme too was false, for even if the revolution did not take place in the advanced countries, the alliance of workers and peasants in the Soviet Union has still the forces to build socialism. See, this that Cornforth is talking now, this is a struggle that existed. This is a political struggle and a political argument that's used in some instances to obscure the relevance of revolutionary theory of philosophy, if you will. Trotsky had a view here that is a really important view, and as I mentioned earlier, the argument that it was the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, which is the majority versus the minority in terms of the socialist movement of Russia, that disagreed about whether or not socialism could be achieved in Russia before capitalism. That's distorted. That's not absolutely the way it happened in the real world. And I'm not trying to go and recreate that argument. But for our purposes, you know, we want to use this method of investigation and analysis, that dialectical historical materialism, because truth is concrete. And that's what we, you know, in the process now of conceiving. In Western European countries, it used to often be said, we must have fascism before communism. First, the capitalists will abandon democracy and introduce the fascist dictatorship. And then the workers will overthrow the fascist dictatorship. But the communists replied, no, we will fight together with all the democratic forces to preserve bourgeois democracy and to defeat the fascists. And that will create the best conditions for going forward to win working class power and to commence to build socialism. These were some of the arguments that they were going through. In fact, there was a tendency in Europe and in Germany to say something to the effect that you know, after the fascists is our time. This was something that was coming from communists or socialists. Anyway. So lastly, today we sometimes hear the argument capitalism means war, therefore war is inevitable. True enough. So long as capitalism, which has long ago entered its last imperialist phase, persists, there must inevitably be conflicts between the rival powers. And these conflicts are such as to entail the inevitability of imperialist wars. But the imperialists cannot make war without the people. The more they prepare war, the more open their aggressiveness becomes. The more one power attempts to impose its domination on another, and the more hardship they impose on the people, the more can the people be rallied to oppose their war. This is fallacious. If you understand the colonial mode of production, you come to understand that most of the wars that are fought for the resources, the contention between powers for the resources coming from the colonies. And these wars have certainly the theft of the resources have popular support from the colonizer population. It's this that's used to raise up the war fervor and different colonial powers when they fight among themselves. But increasingly they haven't had to fight among themselves because the colonized end up doing so much of the fighting for them. For example, in Vietnam, something more than 70% of when the French were dominating forces in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese people rose up to fight against them, more than 70% of so-called French troops were from colonial countries. These were colonized people fighting those wars for them. And something like from 50 to 65% of the people who fought against the US, fought for the US or in the US Army against the Vietnamese people who were colonized were colonial subjects, African people from the United States. So the colonized fought those wars for them. And these were wars that were fought over colonial resources, colonial loot. in which most instances will have the support of the general colonial population. It's only when the population has to pay a horrible consequence or a significant consequence that their fervor for war has been stemmed. When body bags of their children sent back, as the Vietnamese became quite proficient in doing, then you see a lull in the desire of fighting and killing that too often occurs, supported by the colonial population itself. And so this whole notion of peace coming because the people will be turned against it is not absolutely true. The question of peace will come as a consequence of the success in the colonized people ourselves in stopping these wars and inflicting consequences on the oppressors. And this is the only thing that's played a major role, which is not to say that we should not attempt to mobilize, as the Vietnamese people did, a people's war that actually encouraged and led opposition to the war against Vietnam by people in the imperialist countries themselves, which is in many ways the significance of the African People's Solidarity Committee and the Uhuru Solidarity Movement that has been created by the African People's Socialist Party, movement and forces that are in many ways ignored, not recognized by much of what might be considered a Black liberation movement, but in fact it continues to work and involve more and more people of the colonizers themselves in opposition to what colonialism is doing to African people, and actually uniting them to engage in a form of self-criticism by paying reparations to African people that go to negating the power of the colonizer through the programs and economic institutions of the African People's Socialist Party. Anyway, Cornforth, and by fighting to preserve peace, we can lay the basis for ending the conditions which pose the inevitability of war. Imperialist war plans can be defeated, we agree. They can be defeated if the working class rallies all the peace-loving forces around itself. And imperialism itself, with a consequent inevitability of war, can be ended if we defeat the imperialist war plans. That will be the best road towards the ending of capitalism itself and the building of socialism. Imperialism will not be ended by waiting for it to wreck itself in inevitable wars, but by uniting to prevent the realization of its war plans. In all these examples, it will be seen that the acceptance of some ready-made scheme, some abstract formula means passivity, support for capitalism, betrayal of the working class and of socialism. But the dialectical approach, which understands things in their concrete interconnection and movement, shows us how to forge ahead, how to fight, what allies to draw in. That is the inestimable value of what is characterized as the Marxist dialectical method to the working class movement and what we recognize to be African internationalism. So, Comrade Director, can you give me some leadership here?
Her Chairman, yes. So we haven't got any questions yet, but what I want to do is go ahead and get into announcements. And if there are no questions after that, we'll continue reading. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chairman, for this study, Dialectical Materialism, and, really the question of African internationalism. Just again, continuing to deepen this understanding. I really appreciate so many of the points made here, especially just, I think the question of African internationalism is really challenging what Cornforth wrote in this particular section, and just in terms of, the colonizers' interpretation and understanding of capitalism, and, how capitalism came into being and how it must be defeated. So African internationalism is like really making it plain. So I just really appreciate this study, Chairman. We are going to go into our announcements, but if you have questions, go ahead, make sure you type them into the chat section, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, type them into the chat so we can take them. But for our announcements, so you know what we got going on throughout our movement, this study is being brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, where we're winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, you can visit theburningspear.com. You can get more political education from Chairman Omali Yeshitela in every issue of the Burning Spear newspaper. Become a subscriber today. Get a 1-year subscription, 12 issues delivered straight to your door or email inbox for $25. And you can gift a subscription to comrades and family members and sponsor prisoner subscription. You can do all of this at theburningspear.com/subscribe. Calling on Spear distributors, get the Spear out into your community. The January Spear is here, so order your bundles right now at burningspearmarketplace.com. Omali Taught Me airs on Black Power 96 FM radio, a project of the African People's Education and Defense Fund with the slogan, not just explaining the world, but changing it. Listen on 96.3 FM in St. Petersburg, Florida, or streaming online at blackpower96.org and on the free Black Power 96 mobile app for your Apple App Store or your Google Play Store. The theory of African internationalism is a theory of practice. All the energy of the African People's Socialist Party is focused on the destruction of colonial capitalism. Africans of the world, go to our website, apspuhuru.org, and fill out our contact form. This coming Wednesday, January 29th at 6 p.m. Central, I think that meant to say December 29th, at 6 p.m. Central, join the African People's Solidarity Committee as they host a discussion with Chairman Omali Yeshitela about the 50th anniversary of the African People's Socialist Party. Register to join the Zoom room at tinyurl.com/reparations and socialism, which is really timely considering the study we just had today. Calling on all party and Uhuru movement members and supporters, attend the 2022 plenary conference of the African People's Socialist Party, February 11th through the 14th, 2022. Our plenaries and congresses have become the vehicles for an ongoing assessment of our work and the conditions in the world affecting our struggle for total liberation and unification of every square inch of Africa and the entire globally dispersed African nation. Registration for this 4-day online conference is just $25. Read the full call to attend by Chairman Omali Yeshitela and register by going to apspplenary.org. Like and follow the Lowezi Kinshasa like page on Facebook for more African internationalist political education. Secretary General Lowezi Kinshasa does frequent live events such as the War of Ideas series. He includes live sessions done in French. To get alerts of when SG Lowezi is going live, make sure to like and follow his page today. Uhuru Foods and Pies is hiring for a part-time baker in both Oakland, California and St. Petersburg, Florida. Culinary training is preferred. Join the work to build an independent African economy by baking for Black Power. To apply, email your resume to oakland.volunteer@uhurufoods.org or mail your resume to 7911 MacArthur Boulevard, Oakland, California, 94605, or call 800-578-5157 for more information. Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles in both Oakland and Philly are hiring full-time truck drivers and full-time marketing coordinators. If you have driving and furniture lifting skills, social media and print marketing experience, and if you can work Wednesday through Sunday, then apply for these positions and contribute your labor and skills to this institution of the African People's Education and Defense Fund. Apply by visiting their website in Oakland, uhurufurniture.blogspot.com, and in Philadelphia, that's uhurufurniturephilly.blogspot.com. On Tuesday nights from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, join Ralph Pointer on What's Happening Blog Talk Radio. Tune in by calling 347-857-3293. Ralph Pointer sits on the Black is Back Coalition Steering Committee and chairs the BIBC's Political Prisoners Working Group and also leads the Lynn Stewart Committee. And we are calling on people to follow the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to the colonial virus COVID-19. APDEP has an international telehealth program, a free resource for African people to get our COVID-19 related questions and concerns answered by licensed doctors and nurses through Project Black Ankh. You can make your free virtual appointment with one of their professional health providers by going to developmentforafrica.org/telehealth. To keep up with our movement events, visit theburningspear.com's events page and subscribe to our mailing list. And last announcement, make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study and support the Omali Taught Me show by donating now at paypal.me/Omali Taught Me. So that will conclude our announcements for today. And looks like the questions are rolling in, Chairman. So we'll get into the Q&A portion. And of course, we want to acknowledge where people are viewing from. So we have with us St. Petersburg, Florida, St. Louis, Missouri, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois, Oakland, California, Michigan, Ghana, Portland, Oregon, Jamaica, Occupied Azania or South Africa, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Moorhead, Minnesota, Pinellas Park, Florida, Huntsville, Alabama, Greenville, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Jamaica, Queens, New York, Germany, Hempstead, New York, Dallas, Texas, Marion County, Georgia, all checking in with us. So, Uhuru, Chairman. So we're going to get into our first question. This one comes from Comrade Diop in Philly. Says, Uhuru, Chairman, I greatly appreciate this multi-part study on dialectical materialism. Can you speak on the question of the nation and how we define the nation? And is it a static thing or is it defined through similar dialectical materialist principles you are discussing now?
Yeah, the nation has to be defined according to the same dialectical principles that we're talking about. You know, dialectical materialism, when applied to history, to society, is referred to as historical materialism. And that what we conceive of as nations is something that has emerged through a dialectical process, if you will, of development. And what we understand nations to be is a consequence of both subjective and objective conditions. Subjective being things in the head, thought of, and objective being things in the world. And in the world, part of what has happened is that a whole economy, a whole what we refer to as a colonial mode of production has come into existence as a consequence of an assault on Africa and many of the people around the world. And this altered history in a very serious kind of way, in a fashion that it resulted in groups of people around the world being connected to each other through economics, an economic foundation that gripped the whole world, locked the entire world into a process, and also was responsible for creating a sense of sameness. That is a subjective factor. That is how people perceive themselves and saw others. It created a sense of sameness. The sense of sameness is the thing that has helped white people to be defined and find themselves as white people versus the rest of the people, and has helped to pull together a lot of otherwise disparate kind of entities, tribes and warring tribes in many instances in Europe, and to a common entity, a sense of sameness. This sense of sameness came about because all of what now we know as Europe was living as a consequence of wealth and resources stolen from Africa and from the rest of the world. This helped to shape their objective conditions and helped to shape their perceptions of each other and the rest of us. So instead of there now being all these disparate ethnic groups, now they even if they maintain some connection ethnically like that, some identity, it becomes no longer the main identity. The main identity now is as a white people, as Europeans. That did not happen before. And their identity is achieved as a consequence of what they are doing, what they have done, and the economic interest that has come to the whole of the society through slavery and colonialism. On the other hand, we have Africans and other people who have our own and have had our own identity, our economies have now been submerged, have been altered, have been destroyed in many instances, and made in many ways appendages or connected to the economy of the oppressor. Nevertheless, it is a common economic life that we share. In this instance, it's an economic life of exploitation that we share with each other. But there are other things that too that contributes, and the fact is that all of us share the same thing, existence, in part because the colonizer has attacked us as Black people, as other people, et cetera. And so this becomes really important in shaping our understanding of who we are in relationship to this other entity that has helped to define us. So the nation, in this instance, the African nation, the white nation of Europe was born as a bourgeois nation. It was born through the emergence, the colonial capitalist system giving rise to what is known as recognized as capitalism of the bourgeoisie coming to power. It's a bourgeois nation. It's and even its consciousness is like that. People refer to it often as an imperial kind of consciousness that you see in white people generally. And now what among Africans, we see a consciousness that is forged in the process of resistance, and the struggle for African people, the consolidation of the African nation is something that the revolution is responsible for. The African People's Socialist Party is responsible for. People who are actually engaged in revolutionary struggle are responsible for helping to consolidate the proletarian African nation. And the African nation is scattered all around the world, has been forcibly dispersed. It has become, and its future will be determined on its ability to conquer its own resources, its land, its labor, et cetera. And this is what will help to consolidate the African nation. So nations are defined by two factors. One, objective, the real economic thing that binds and holds them together. And two, related to that, a consciousness of themselves and a sense of sameness that emerges through this relationship. That was a hope of 2-minute or 3-minute kind of discussion on something that could actually, as you know, go for a long period of time, Comrade Diop. It's just an abbreviated kind of discussion. And I'm really happy to see people ask these easy, simply explained kinds of questions. Uhuru. Anyway, I hope it was helpful, Comrade Diop, at least as a means of beginning the discussion. But go to both the political report to the 6th and the 7th Congress. And we do a much more elaborate discussion on the question of the nation. Please check that out. And almost every time, we're always talking about it, but the 6th and the 7th political report, actually the 7th is simply a reproduction of the statement of the position of the nation that was put forth in the 6th political report. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Diop, for your question. And just a little plug, you can find both of those political reports on burningsfairmarketplace.com and on Easy Equilibrium or Vanguard. So, Uhuru.
Let me say something, Comrade. This question of the nation is also connected to this issue of a colonial mode of production. That something happened. And what Africans and the rest of the world have been confronted with for a long time, for a few hundred years, is that we've been made objects of history, while the colonizers have been made subjects of history. It is they who have written the history that's defined the world, et cetera, as a consequence of coming to power through theft of our own resources. It's hard for us to even understand the world or see the world because we're looking at the world through the lenses of the oppressor. And what African internationalism does, it provides us with the ability to see the world with our own eyes. And I know that may not sound like something that's very significant in some quarters, but it is truly significant. I think this upcoming plenary that the party will be having in February of next year will do more to elaborate on this question of the colonial mode of production and its significance than anything else. But the fact is that we've got people who call themselves revolutionaries and things like that. I'm not just talking about the hustlers and the philosophical chameleons who will be whatever is necessary to get quote unquote likes and views. But I'm talking about people who actually engage and struggle. The real people have been trapped and locked into an inability to see ourselves as the forces, critical forces defining history and the world, and to assume our responsibility to make this history and to lead our people to make this history. And that's problematic. And anytime, and most often when you hear people who sound like that's what they're trying to do, they've been bogged down in superstition and a certain kind of fanciful things that biological analysis and things like that, which obviously do not help, because if biology were enough to get us free, it would have been enough to keep us from being enslaved. It's not that. There's some other things that we have to understand, and African internationalism helps us to do that. So I just wanted to say that, Comrade Director Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, I really appreciate you making, especially that last point. And again, thank you, Diop, for raising the question. So, Comrade, our next question comes from Comrade Matsamela. And he asks, Uhuru, Chairman, in your overview, you acknowledge the importance of doing the work while not vacating the importance of theory. Would you say that the lack of theory is what makes us fall prey to spontaneity? Also, does spontaneity birth opportunism?
Who is that from again?
Matsamela.
And yeah, I think that that's really important question, because some people have misunderstood us when we talked about opposition to spontaneity. We mean that sometimes in general terms, sometimes the way most people understand spontaneous. But part of what we mean by spontaneity is movement that's not connected to an end. Like we say, philosophy helps us to recognize what it is that we're struggling for. That means that everything that we're doing is guided by the long-term interest, by what our objectives, and our objectives as African internationalists is the total liberation, unification of Africa under the leadership of the African working class, which will result in the actual conquest of political power by the workers of the world. That's what we're fighting for. So if you don't have a theory, if you don't have a philosophy that guides what it is you're doing, then other things can come to substitute your long-term view. And what often people refer to as their long-term view is simply a tactic or something else that they're utilizing. That becomes the long-term view in the absence of theory. And so that's where we say spontaneity. People have referred to spontaneity in the past as the mother of opportunism, because opportunism, as we've just talked about a few minutes ago, is simply sacrificing the long-term interests of the African revolution of the working class, African working class, to some short-term benefit or some other group interest that doesn't take us to where it is that we're trying to go. And and that's what we see most often when we have groups who are really clever sometimes in their discussions and what they have to say. They can say it quite cleverly, but the point is, who are you philosophically? Where is it that you're trying to go? That's the thing that informs us as to whether or not it's viable. It helps us to understand the viability of it. And even if we disagree with it, it gives us something that we can debate. But to just not be informed by anything means that anything will do. And that's what spontaneity is. And that's the thing that undermines the struggle for revolution. And we have very good conversations sometimes, very clever conversations sometimes for people about why we should do something that doesn't even provide any long-term consequences for us, but they can say it quite well. And because of this, a lot of people are bamboozled and misled. And that's a form of opportunism. And I'm not saying whether or not they're crooks, like some people we know are crooks. They're just absolutely crooks, thugs, thieves. They're one day they're for revolution, next day they're for Jesus, the next day they're for all other kinds of things. These are criminals just about, and people who hustle the money from our folk based on our poverty and immiseration and colonial domination of our folk. They're just thieves and thugs, and they make prey of us just as the colonizer does as well. And so, I mean, those are real forces that's out there. But the force that we're talking about now, which includes those forces, but also includes people, those forces who claim to be leading us, but they don't have a to what end. They tell us that this is about the revolution, and this is what we're doing now, right? And before the revolution, et cetera. But then they can't be for the revolution, because revolution presupposes certain things. It presupposes, among other things, a revolutionary organization, because revolution is about taking power. Have you created an organization, the purpose of which is to take and wield political power? It talks about a theory, something that where it is that you're trying to go. Revolution has to do all of those kinds of things, et cetera. And if you can talk revolution, but you don't have that organization, you haven't been a part of that organization, you've ignored and sometimes done everything you can to besmirch and undermine that organization, you're not about revolution. And so it's not connected to the long-term interests of the people. And it helps to bamboozle masses of people and to take us down the wrong path. Uhuru comment, Masamela.
Uhuru, Chairman, you said a word you just said a word. Uhuru. Thank you, Masamela, for your question. And our next question is coming from Director Tafari in Occupied Azania. And he asks, Marxists say the previous modes of productions happen naturally, but socialism will happen through conscious efforts to bring it about. Is that how we see things also as African internationalists?
Well, I think that Marxists at one point said that, first of all, socialism is a relatively recent concept. It was Marx talked about the stages of human development as he characterized them, going from capitalism to communism. And what we refer to as socialism is this sort of interim period, if you will, where the workers have come to power and have state power, where the state continues to exist. Communism is a point where the state is no longer there. Marx talked about the withering away of the state, this organ of oppression, coercion, and what have you, that comes into existence with the advent of class society. This is what Marx talked about. So to get to communism, however, there is this stage where the workers have come to power, and the state is the workers in arms, as opposed to this other entity that existed up to now. So the working class is the state, and it wields political power. That's what socialism is characterized as. And but the communism that Marx talked about is something that theoretically comes about in the same way that the other modes of production have theoretically come about according to Marx. I think that Marx has primary effort was defining all of this phenomena as universal as it occurred. And it wasn't universal what he's talked about. The primitive communism that he talked about, the slavery mode of production that he taught. I don't think any of them were universal. I think a lot of them were particular and peculiar to Europe, that you may have seen some other examples some other place. And I don't think it's an accident that the ideal that Marx was looking for that came to be communism was initially described as primitive communism, or primitive communalism when it was seen in other places. Harry Morgan, this anthropologist from the United States who did the study on the Iroquois Indians in particular, is one who came to some kinds of conclusions about classless societies, et cetera, through that example. And what Marxists have done subsequent to that, with whatever other investigation may have come about, is to conclude that since this situation with the Iroquois Indians and the others that Morgan talked about, they concluded that that had to be early stages of human development, since where Europe was the highest stage of human development. But the point is that I think this was an error, and it's always an error that's been made by the colonizer. It doesn't, and this is to say that Marx was a part of the colonizer nation for your benefit, for the benefit of Marx. This is not something I'm saying to besmirch Marx. I'm saying to talk about relations of production that existed in the world, that in all of us occupied places in these relations of production, and Marx was not. Marx was also occupied a place there. And so like all of the people in Europe were colonizers. It didn't matter whether or not they were the main ones or not. Their society, whole society they lived in was a colonial-based society. And so Comrade Tafari, the fact is that it's those, we have to consciously be involved in overturning this colonial mode of production. And that's the thing that will unleash the productive forces of the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world and bring about the new society that we are talking about. And so notwithstanding what Marxists may have said about how socialism comes about, we say that we are going to have to bring it about ourselves through struggle, revolutionary struggle, and there's nothing inherent about how society evolves that will make that happen for us. We have to intervene. That's the thing that's really important for us to understand. Human intervention under the leadership of the most advanced sector of the population, which is those people who produce all the damn value. Collectively, socially, we have to intervene, and we have to have the capacity. We have to have the organized will to do that in the form of a theory, philosophy that takes us to that end. We have to have the organization to make that happen in the form of organization that will allow for the envelopment of cadre who have made the conquest of political power by the oppressed its basic aim. This is what this organization exists for. We don't exist for anything else. And in the process of this existence, of course, we enter into various kinds of relationships with each other in the world, but our existence is based on the conquest of political power, economic power by the African working class, the liberation of the productive forces so that African people will have access to all of our resources and can make determinations in our own interests. And we will have access to the revolutionary political leadership that will make that possible and necessary. Uhuru, Comrade Tafari.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Director Tafari, for your question. Moving now to our next one, comes from Comrade King L. in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Says, Uhuru, Chairman, I know this is a simplification, but for the sake of my question, in the Haitian example, it was the enslaved colonized that waged the revolution. In the French and Bolshevik examples, it was the proletariat that led the struggle. And in the Chinese Revolution under the direction of Mao, it was the so-called peasantry that waged revolution. In your view, what do you see will be the way for the contemporary African and colonized people to wage successful revolution?
Well, in the first place, all of those iterations, all of those names that you put forth were iterations of toiling masses of the people who create all the value that's necessary for us to live with: food, clothing, and shelter. Whether they, I forgot how they were characterized, as you just mentioned, in Haiti, or proletariat, or peasantry, et cetera. Those are the people who the whole society required in order to live. And I think what is one important interventions by Mao Zedong was the whole concept of the of the countryside, that you had city life and the fledgling, if you will, kind of capitalism that required for its lifeblood on what it could get from the peasantry. And the peasantry organized the peasantry, and they were able to cut off life in the cities and what have you. So the point is that the peasantry represented in this colonial context the lifeblood of the iteration of colonialism that we saw in China. I think that King L, that the revolution we're talking about for African people is something that comes as a consequence of us recognizing colonialism as a mode of production itself. So we're not dealing with feudalism. We're not dealing with how capitalism has been defined purely as a contest between workers and bosses. We're talking about colonialism as a mode of production. And critical to that issue is the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. So we say the class question is really concentrated in the colonial question. And key to that, again, is the relationship between colonized and colonizers. And among the colonized, just as among the colonizers, there are different social forces at work. Some of them are artificial to the extent that they rely on a relationship with the colonized for their existence. And sometimes we refer to them as like primitive. But the fact is that all of them, the workers are the ones who produce value in every instance. The people are the producers, whether they're toiling masses, whether they are considered the so-called working class peasantry or what have you. The critical forces are the producers. And it is we who have to be organized within the colonial system to take this struggle against colonialism to a final conclusion to a final revolutionary conclusion. So, which is why we organize and work the way we do throughout the world, which is why we have created this regional strategy for the African People's Socialist Party. So whether we are located in Africa as Comrade Tafari, or whether we are located in the Caribbean as the comrades who head up our work there, or in the United States, et cetera. We're part of the same process. And I think that's really important for us to understand. And another aspect of that is to understand that when we talk about the African toiling masses or working class, we're not talking about a class force that's simply in Africa or South Africa. For example, someone argued with me years ago in South Africa about how the African working class is such a minority, people don't have jobs, and people peasantry. And what we're saying is the African working class is international. It's not just something that's located in South Africa or in Ghana or in some particular place like that. We're everywhere. The working class is in Brazil, and it's in Detroit in the United States, or used to be. I mean, it's being pushed out there, but various places. And the African Internationalist, African Socialist International, gives us access to the workers of the world, African workers of the world, so that we can make plans based on deployment of workers and everybody else wherever they need to be deployed in order to forward the African revolution. So in some instances, I think that might make a bit hazy or fuzzy this whole concept of the working class. But what we are talking of, King L, we are talking, however, about the producers and the producers of life, people who may be characterized as proletariat in terms of their somehow being engaged, particularly in capitalist industry. We're talking about people who struggling in Brazil, in various other places around the world, producing life. And this life may not be seen as closely or clearly in Brazil, or as clearly even in South Africa or Ghana. But you can see this life when we go to a supermarket in the United States, where nothing is ever out of season, where you can buy stuff, what have you, because this is the international working class, African working class, and others who are producing all this value. We just don't have access to it. I hope I spoke to it, King Yell. I know it was relatively convoluted kind of response that I gave. But the reason for that in part is because I had to step on some preconceived notions that have informed our ideas and the narrative that we engaged in right now. So I hope it was helpful, King Yell. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, and Uhuru, thank you, King L, for your question. Our next one comes from Comrade Life in Tampa, Florida. Uhuru, Chairman, thank you for this study. The party has long maintained there is no need to make up stuff about the colonizer because the concrete truth is sufficient. I unite. Please explain why it is problematic to base an analysis on some idea not in accord with things as they really are, even if such an analysis sometimes leads to a correct conclusion, specifically the detriment of such analysis to our revolutionary struggle.
Oh, thank you, Comrade Life. Yeah, I mean, people can motivate, can be motivated by any kind of thing to attack a problem. And sometimes, even if they use the wrong analysis, they can succeed in dealing with the problem, that specific problem. But the issue arises when others of us around the world attempt to utilize that example as the basis for solving our problems. And it is false. It is wrong. It doesn't take us to a conclusion. It's not something that can be taken and we can't locate in that principles that have some kind of universality that can be utilized by the African working class in various places. There are no laws that inform us, just sometimes just the wild declaration. And just because somebody says that if we use a certain kind of juju, and when we're in battle with the colonizers, the bullets won't kill us, and we can be successful in battle, and we win the war, the battle. It doesn't mean that the juju was correct. It could mean that we just had a whole bunch of frightening bad shots that were shooting at us, and that's not going to work it's not going to inform our struggle overall. It's not going to be something that we can work with, et cetera. So it's really important to look for a relationship between a real scientific interpretation and analysis of the world that we are struggling with in order to come to good conclusions, revolutionary conclusions. So yeah, Life, you're right that sometimes someone may succeed in doing something, even if their theory is unscientific, or if they don't even proclaim to be motivated by theory. Something can happen, but it's not something that's going to be good for the overall revolution. In fact, it can send whole generations off on the wrong path for long periods of time. So, Uhuru.
Uhuru Life, thank you for your question, and thank you, Chairman. Our next question comes from Comrade Jamal in Moorhead, Minnesota. Says Uhuru, Comrade Chairman, do the current events in Ethiopia represent a development in the theory of African internationalism, or a special instance particular to Ethiopia as an example of an internal colony? It may not be widely understood that Ethiopia is an outcome of hundreds of years of war between ethnic groups, which has manifested as quote unquote national questions.
Well, Ethiopia, some people may not know that thousands of people are dying in Ethiopia right now, being killed through this fratricidal, it appears, like struggle happening between different ethnic groups in Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is trapped, again, comment, Jamal, as we've said, you can't take Ethiopia. You can't just say Ethiopia has this history. Ethiopia does have a history, but Ethiopia has a history also that is articulating itself, that is being experienced and expressed in relationship to the whole of Africa and the rest of the world. And a fundamental problem with Africa, because you see the same evidence of ethnic war and struggle afflicting Africa everywhere, all over, and it's something that's been worked with great efficiency by our colonizers, playing off one sector of the population against the other based on what perceived to be ethnic interests. So I understand this whole history of ethnic struggle, but those struggles are something that's generally resolved within the context of an existing social system. The problem is the social system that we look at in Africa is one that is much greater than the territory within which they seem to be articulating themselves. Ethiopia is more than just that place there. It is something that has a relationship with all of Africa, with all of its neighboring entities. That's why you see all kinds of forces who don't necessarily consider themselves Ethiopian and Ethiopian engaged in that struggle. For us as African people, and this is a really critical thing for the African internationalists, for the African Socialist International, and for African internationalism to help us understand that there is one Africa, and that this Africa, this African interest as African people has to become the dominant primary interest. It's not to liquidate. The objective is not to liquidate the reality that in every society, every group, there are several different identities that people have. And so that people may have particular identities that makes them feel warm and fuzzy when thought about the practices and some kinds of traditions that may exist within that ethnic group. But the thing is that the overall group is something that's fighting to express itself in 1,000 different ways. And that is the national, that we are one nation of people. And Ethiopia is not a nation. And then everything that you've just said helps to make that point. You've got this struggle between different ethnic groups there. And what we're in the process as the African Revolution, as African internationalists, the African Socialist International is to consolidate the African nation that has been forcibly dispersed around the world, so that an African in Haiti can feel as much Ethiopian as someone as Tigray or Oroma or any other entity that's located right there inside those borders. And those borders of Ethiopia didn't come about by themselves, and they are not maintained by themselves. They are also maintained by the borders that have been created by the colonizer all around Ethiopia, etc. So there is no Ethiopian solution, except that we have to take the African internationalist, African People's Socialist Party into every one of these crevices and every place on the continent of Africa and in the African world, and have to organize concretely on the ground there. And this is what every African internationalist, every member of the African People's Socialist Party must be really begin to understand, that it's not going to happen accidentally. We're going to have to actually organize the party and members of the party cadre who would take the understanding of African people all over, and in Ethiopia, not just take an understanding, but actually lead struggle where on concretely on the ground, we seize territory, we seize power, we break down the perceptions that's existed there before. And this is not as crazy as it may seem. I mean, I remember how in Ghana what is called Ghana now, the British had assumed that their success in this divide and conquer process of pitting ethnic groups against each other and locking people into certain circumstances with the economic power that they exerted in the colonies, just as they exert economic power all over Africa, including not the British, but the imperialists do, including in Ethiopia. And so they, as a consequence of the success and part of the revolution in Kenya, or the struggle in Kenya, where the Kenyan land and freedom army picked up guns and said Uhuru and killed the colonizers and what have you, the British felt compelled to try to let elections happen in there to transfer power without the colonizers rising up. And they had the thought that they can do elections that and they would be able to manipulate the outcome by this playing the ethnic groups against each other. But Nkrumah succeeded in uniting all of the different ethnics in this territory called Ghana and winning that election. Lumumba, the same thing happened in Congo. I'm using these examples as what our possibilities are. But I shouldn't even have to go to Ghana or to Congo to do that. How many different groups of Africans from different ethnicities that went into Haiti? Haiti was a transit for Africans coming from Africa and being shipped to different parts of the world. And yet we saw these Africans being able to combine into a social force to fight the French. Look at what we see in the United States, Africans, different ethnicities coming from everywhere. People like to say that Africans in the United States have lost some kind of cultural coherence or cohesion because we don't speak a particular African language as such. But what has happened is that we see the possibilities of beginning to represent themselves in certain ways because we don't fight or struggle or involve ourselves, even though it can get crazy and we get played against each other in the United States as well. But we don't get played against each other in the United States as one ethnic group against another ethnic group. And so we see the potential in all of Africa and the African world for that kind of consolidation. So it's not mysterious, it's not maybe it can happen. And Comrade Jamal, I think you're a great example of that, where you are, having been born on the continent of Africa, or if not yourself, your family, and then living there as an African in the United States. And that same thing is true. There are people in our party whose parents or themselves were born in Grenada, Panama, are born on the continent of Africa, all kinds of places. And in our party who from Congo, who from Ghana, from South Africa, and we exist in one organization and are able to identify as Africans. And what I really love is how that expresses itself, particularly in occupied Tanzania or so-called South Africa, where the comrades are clear there that South Africa has to die. But they're African people and death to South Africa because it's a colonial construct. And every place that we live, whether or not it came about directly as a consequence of colonialism, as Ghana or Sierra Leone, or indirectly as Ethiopia, because it is a consequence of colonialism, because Ethiopia does not exist in some kind of vacuum, independent and separate from the rest of Africa. It achieves its identity not only because of what is happening inside the borders of what we characterize as Ethiopia, but also in relationship to all the rest of Africa. That is the entity that we're looking for. So, Comrade Jamal, I know I went a lot of different places with that, but I hope I did respond adequately to what it was that you just raised. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Thank you, Jamal, for your question. And I would take another one, but you know how these questions be, Chairman, where they kind of require extensive answers. So I don't want to go ahead and jump into another question because we have to wrap up, but I really want to appreciate this study. And just to say to everyone that if you tune in with us next week, we will take your question in the next portion of Q&A.
let me say this, that Comrade King L, this place, India, is still suffering the consequences of British colonialism. Divide and conquer succeeded tremendously in India. And as you know, the territory that we call India has been chopped up, and different parts of what was previously considered India. Now, allegedly, you have Kashmir, you have all these different places where war and conflict still continues to exist as a consequence of a colonial mode of production that imposes itself. China, extraordinary revolutionary movement where the Chinese actually consolidated and unified China, with the exception of these two outliers called Taiwan or Hong Kong, et cetera, that the Chinese are determined to deal with as well, and that the imperialists are determined to try to use as something to continue to keep the Chinese people split and to use as ammunition against China in order to maintain the status quo. I know I overspoke and I didn't deal adequately, with the stuff that King L just raised, but I thought I just wanted to touch on that in passing. Uhuru, Comrade Director.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to you for any final closing remarks before we actually end today's study.
I just want to appreciate everybody being here on today and tell everybody to look forward to what's going to be an extraordinary plenary that we'll be doing in February. And it is going to be extraordinary. And within the next couple of weeks or so, then we'll begin studying from that political report to the plenary, the third plenary of the party's 7th Congress. Thank you, Comrade Akile, and all of you for being here today. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, again, just really want to express appreciation for your leadership and taking us through this study, deepening our understanding around these really critical questions, and making studying and grasping theory a part of the culture of our people. And I just want to also appreciate all of you for, tuning in with all of your questions, your comments, and just to say again that don't worry if your question was not taken, because we will look at it in next week's study. So thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spirit TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. And continue to support the Omali Taught Me show by donating to paypal.me/Omali Taught Me and register for the party's 3rd 7th Congress plenary at apspplenary.org. We'll catch you guys next Sunday. Uhuru and Vanguard up.